Well, speaking of squiggly lines, your term, what about the issue of settlements in the West Bank?
Well, we got more squiggly lines when we talk about settlements. As we know, since 1967, and particularly in the last 20 years, the rate and growth of settlements in the West Bank has accelerated rather dramatically, particularly in relationship to the prospects for peace, almost an inverse relationship. When there's been a serious peace process, people have tended to be a little more cautious about thinking of settlements. When there's no peace process, there are Israelis who have a view that the West Bank is as much a part of their homeland as any place else, and they have wanted, therefore, to settle in that area. It's largely recognized now, certainly by the middle, the center, and the left part of the Israeli political system, and frankly, increasingly on the right, that the prospect of Israel holding on to all those settlements simply doesn't exist. And so the two sides started talking some years ago, and then actually talked more seriously in 2008 about the idea of a return of the territories that Israel occupied to the 1967 lines, but with a land swap that would allow for some significant portion of settlement blocks that are adjacent to that line to be incorporated into the state of Israel, in return for which the state of Palestine would be compensated by equivalent quality lands and equivalent quantity lands elsewhere. In other words, you end up with a one-to-one swap that results in a 100% return of territories. There's still a lot of details to be worked out. What does it mean to have quality, one-to-one? Nobody wants a lack of arable lands and so forth. But a principle has been articulated now, which actually may give us an answer to this question. A few years ago, Israel started building a security barrier. It's a fence and a wall at various places. And over time, even the Israeli Supreme Court, through a series of challenges to the location of that barrier, has started to push it closer and closer to what in the parlance is called the Green Line. In other words, the line separating Israel and the West Bank. And so the parties are not only negotiating now on the basis of a principle which may work, but on the ground there may not be that much of a difference in the actual placement of that border from where that security barrier is currently being erected.
Third issue then has to do with refugees, usually discussed in terms of Palestinian refugees and whether they would be able to return to places where they live that are now within the borders of Israel.
Well, as you mentioned, it's usually talked about in terms of Palestinian refugees. Israel has included in this discussion the refugees from Arab countries who were forced to leave as a result of the creation of the State of Israel and who made their way to Israel or other places. It's hard to envisage how that issue gets entangled into the Palestinian issue. Palestinians have argued that whether or not Israel claims there should be compensation or something for those refugees, that has to be taken care of with Arab countries. And so on the Palestinian refugee issue, which is the one that will be dealt with between Israelis and Palestinians, it's probably the one area where a principle has not yet been established. The Israeli position is that once a Palestinian state is established, there will be a homeland for the Palestinians to return to, and therefore Palestinian refugees can find their right of return, which they believe is incorporated in United Nations resolutions. They can find that right of return by moving to Palestine. Palestinians have not yet accepted that because they say that in their view, the UN resolutions should allow for Palestinians to return to the actual homes they left behind in the State of Israel. What was very interesting in the Palestine papers that were leaked was the recognition by Palestinian leaders internally. In other words, this was not supposed to be for external consumption, but internally Palestinian leaders recognized that it was not realistic to assume that Palestinian refugees would be going to the State of Israel in large numbers. In fact, in one of those leaked papers, the president of Palestine asks rhetorically, how can it be that Palestinians would go to Israel and Israel would remain a Jewish state, which is really something you would expect to hear from an Israeli leader, not from a Palestinian leader. So there is an intellectual understanding on the part of Palestinians that once there is a two-state solution, refugees will find their way to Palestine, just as Jewish immigrants will find their way to Israel. But until now, they haven't figured out a way to deal with this principle in the context of negotiations.